Welcome back. We are on week 4 of Great Books for Hard Times, and we're going to have a little bit of an adventure today. We are talking about books that have to do with end times. In my lifetime, I cannot remember a period in history when there have been more people talking about the end of the world, end times, days of judgment from different perspectives as there are right now, right? There's a lot of noise about such things. What does an apocalypse look like if not a pandemic and social unrest and saber rattling on the part of superpowers, etc., etc. So I thought it would be kind of a fun way to hopefully take a little bit of the anxiety out of that whole series of questions, attitudes, and perspectives to look at great books that have something to say about end times, about what it is, what it isn't, etc. And I thought we should start, first of all, with just a little acknowledgement that the book, the library of books that is the Bible, has some things to say about end times, that there is apocalyptic literature both in the Old Testament, right? The prophet Daniel addresses it. Some of the minor prophets have visions about the day of the Lord, the judgment day. And then, of course, the Revelation, the book of Revelation, specifically concerns itself with this vision of a new heaven and a new earth and God coming to judge and to redeem and to make new. But I just wanted to remind all of us, I've got a Kleenex stuck in this Bible so that you can see how much of the Bible is other than the book of Revelation versus how much of the Bible is, and this is not even true to the book of Revelation. Here we go. There we go. This is the book of Revelation without the maps and appendices at the back. So just wanted to kind of remind those of us that tend to maybe mistake scripture and scriptural references to the end of days as an excuse to obsess when we're having a significant period of historic tumult right now. We just need to stay mindful that scripture has very little to say, relatively speaking, about the end of days. And the one thing that's very clear in Scripture, Jesus says this on several occasions, is that it will be a surprise. It will come like a thief in the night. It will come when we are not expecting it. And given the fact that at least half of the speaking population in the world right now is asking whether or not this is the end of the world, I would say, based on what Jesus says, that it probably isn't, right? Because everybody's so focused on it. So, with all of that as our background, let's talk a little bit about some wonderful popular books and book series right now that treat issues that are pertinent when we're talking about the apocalypse, the end of days, okay? The Harry Potter series is not an obvious jumping off point for this talk, except that what it deals with, which is the ultimate clash of light and dark, of good and evil, this kind of cosmic significance of the battle in the last Harry Potter book, that really is what we are talking about in a specific way when we talk about end times, right? And Harry Potter and the Hunger Games and the Lord of the Rings, these books all have as their foundation these cosmic questions of whether good or evil will triumph, right? In the Hunger Games, we have a very specific dystopian vision of a future society. But the issues that Katniss is facing are pretty similar to the issues that Harry faces in the Harry Potter series. And dialing it back a generation, they're pretty similar to the issues that Frodo and his companions face in the Lord of the Rings, or that the Pevensley kids face in the Narnia series, right? All of these 20th and 21st century popular, very, very popular, very kind of staples of popular culture, these book series really have at their core a huge conflict, a huge ultimate battle where the history of life itself hangs in the balance. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about end times, when we talk about what would it look like, what will it look like, what could it look like if everything that has been suddenly is no more. Now, one of the things that strikes us when we start talking about this from a specifically contemporary perspective is that, yes, we can see how these themes are traceable all the way back over hundreds and hundreds of years. And I want to give you some examples of really awesome books that dealt with these themes in different generations, in different cultural contexts. But before we kind of rewind the tape to these earlier books, I do want us to acknowledge some of the specifics of our modern books, and often the movies that are spawned by these modern books, some of the specific characteristics that make them contemporary, right? That root them in our culture. And there are some aspects and attributes of these later books that are specific to our time and our culture. The concept of zombies, for example, is something that has very, very long-standing historic and quasi-religious roots, but the all-pervasiveness of zombies, this idea that zombies are fitting not just a literary trope or device, but you could have a whole TV series, several TV series based on zombies, multi-movie series based on zombies. Where is that rooted, and what does a zombie concept have to do with this obsession with end of days? Well, if you think about it logically, zombies as the undead, as the corpses who have somehow been partially reanimated for the specific purpose of devouring living people, that is kind of the quintessential embodiment of nihilism. Boy, I'm just packing on the $5 words here, aren't I? But nihilism as a philosophical school that basically says there is no hope, therefore there is no point, is kind of the alter ego of a materialistic culture where the only point is consumption, right? Consumption of goods, of services, of pleasures. Well, for a zombie, the only point is consumption as well. It's just the consumption of living things. So you can see in that particular instance how a device that we can trace all the way back to the beginning of the 1800s with the fabulous novel by Mary Shelley called Frankenstein, right? I mean, Frankenstein is kind of the first famous zombie, the monster that's been stitched together from the dissected remnants of multiple corpses. And he has been kind of a paradigm for horror ever since Mary Shelley wrote the book. And you can see that his modern iteration, right, whether it's somebody rewriting Pride and Prejudice so that it's Pride and Prejudice and zombies, basically we've just taken Mary Shelley's image of this destructive created thing, this thing that's created specifically for destruction, and we see it played out in an ultra-modern way with ultra-modern sound effects and ultra-modern biomedical engineering backgrounds, etc. But one of the things that I hope is encouraging to us as we look at what can be a very discouraging topic, and the way that topic plays out in our contemporary setting, is that many of our fears, many, if not most, of the things that terrify us and the things that we dread are simply modernized versions of fears and sources of dread that go all the way back to our earliest writings as a species, right? So we don't need to be concerned that we have somehow created horrors and dread that are new to mankind. We just haven't. We just haven't. So When we look at these really modern series, Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, and then dial it back a little bit to the C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien series, what we're doing is we're tracing story cycles, hero cycles, big battle cycles, and kind of seeing how they fit in to different generations, right? And how each generation takes the culturally specific images and characters and slots them into a pretty standard sequence of events. But one of the things that is true for us in our modern understanding of end of the world, apocalyptic, scary books is that we are building on an immediate set of literary precursors that came out of 20th century reactions to totalitarian governments. And I just want to kind of take us on a little bit of a tour of that, because if you haven't read these books that are not ancient books at all, but that are very much source material for a lot of the stuff that's on the bestseller list right now that would go into this category, then I really encourage you to read these originals, because they remain so powerful in their storytelling immediacy and their capacity to make us have adrenaline rushes and get anxious and then have the catharsis of it being in a book, which can be really a wonderful escape from the anxiety and things that are going on around us from which there is not yet that much of a cathartic rest. Right? Not yet. So when we think about these source books, what are we thinking about? So the earliest 20th century masterpiece, if you will, in the genre of dystopian apocalyptic literature was published in 1932. So we're in the run-up to World War II. The world has been changed forever by World War I, by trench warfare, by that clash of man against machine that really changed everything forever in terms of the way man thought about himself in his environment. And the Nazis were coming to power, but still a long way off from actually being in power. And Aldous Huxley wrote the book Brave New World. And if you read it now, there is a certain element of quaintness to his depiction of the way that this future society, this future dystopia, is going to engineer babies for the specific purpose of creating social castes so that people who are slated by the state to do the most menial jobs, their embryos, as they develop in this laboratory, are deprived of oxygen and nutrients as they reach a certain age, a certain gestational age, so that they will not have intellectual capacity to want to do anything beyond the menial job for which they are intended. Brave New World is so thought-provoking for us, not because it has come to pass, but because so many of the things which concerned Huxley remain concerns for us in our day and age, but they're in very different forms than he could have anticipated. This whole idea of human destiny, human agency in the face of a controlling state, and especially of a controlling state that uses medical interventions to achieve its own ends. It's a very prescient and powerful book. So if you haven't read Brave New World, I think you should. Similarly, just a bit later, George Orwell, the giant, the master of dystopian novels, his two masterpieces, Animal Farm was published in 1945, and 1984 was published in 1949. And those two books, incredibly cynical and pessimistic depictions of kind of a layer of these conflicts, right? You have the conflict between good and evil that takes place in the individual, at the individual level. Protagonists, whether they are animals who are having these personification issues, right? And struggling with whether they're going to be the beasts that their human owners have been, versus the systems that these animals are slotting into that condemn them to the same meaningless lives that they had before they took power. So you've got individual versus systemic conflict. Does any of this sound relevant to what we are experiencing, right, in our society right now? Similarly, in 1984, you have very highly developed protagonists whose romantic relationship and whose individual characters just evoke a lot of empathy on the part of the reader. And you've got this system in which these two are trying to operate that evokes a lot of uncertainty, who to trust, what to trust. The language of the state is very, very benevolent. It's all for everyone's good. Big Brother is here to take care of everyone, but then the violent, despotic way that gets carried out creates this incredibly layered, multi-textured picture of conflict at the individual level and at the systemic level. So just to reiterate, Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's Animal Farm in 1984 as kind of the iconic beginning of our 20th century great dystopian novels. Beyond that, in 1953, Arthur Miller, who's a great American playwright, wrote a play that is as much fun to read, like a novel, as it is to watch. And there was a movie version of it made in the early 2000s with Daniel Day-Lewis. But the play, if you can get your hands on a copy of the script for The Crucible, it is quite a read. And what he was doing was basically using the historic story of the Salem witch trials in the late 1600s. He was fictionalizing and dramatizing various real people's characters from that actual episode and putting it in a stage play as a way of calling out and protesting the McCarthy communist witch hunts that were taking place in the American government and American society in the 1950s. So The Crucible is a real window into paranoia and state control and mind manipulation as seen through the lens of a man of the 1950s looking back to the 1690s and drawing parallels between those two epochs. Again, a fascinating exercise for us as we are culturally wrestling with what does it mean to retain history without being unduly burdened by those parts of our history that are shameful, right? And so all of the messaging, if you will, that was very relevant in the 1950s when Miller's play was first written, I think is very freshly relevant to us today in 2020. Another book that if you missed somehow, I commend to you is William Golding's The Lord of the Flies. It is a picture of what happens when boys are shipwrecked on an island, the sort of Darwinian substrata of a hierarchy that immediately evolves, and then the conflict, right? Like we're saying in all of these books, the conflict between good and evil, the conflict between putting the needs of the group ahead of personal needs, the conflict between survival of the fittest versus taking care of the weak. It is a gripping and unforgettable story, and a quick read, I might add. So if you missed those great 20th century novels, I commend them to you, just not just for philosophical and intellectual erudition, but because they're just great stories. They're really well read. They are really well written and engaging, and they will draw you in and get you out of your surroundings for however long you are in those pages. The origins of those really amazing books, we can go back to the century before. And if you haven't read Edgar Allan Poe, oh my goodness, I just commend him to you. He is the master of the short story genre, and then he is a master of the kind of Gothic horror, specifically Gothic horror writing, that encapsulates this conflict that we're talking about, the good, the evil, the sense of individual destiny being bound up in forces beyond the individual's control. If you haven't read, for example, The Fall of the House of Usher, such an incredible description of the end of a family line, the end of a whole section of civilization, and of a friend who is sucked in to this story of dissolution, decay, disintegration that really isn't his story, but it becomes his story just by association. Really cool, kind of bone-chilling read. And then, of course, the seminal books I've already referred to, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which was published in 1805, Dracula by Bram Stoker, the end of that same century. These two books, Frankenstein and Dracula, I mean, we all know them as the best monster books ever written, right? The seminal books on which all the other monster stories kind of rest. But underneath, they are also allegories, if you will, for some of the conflicts that are still being played out in the pop cultural stage, right? You've got all of these questions of individual agency versus structures and states and the way that society manifests itself in terms of confining people or liberating people. These books take those issues to an operatic level, if you will, and not only do they give you a really great scare, but they do shed this kind of strange, different perspective on the kinds of conflicts that we've been talking about this whole time. The good versus evil, the ultimate battle, if you will. So I commend these to you as well. As we draw to a close, I think one of the most important statements to be made when we are talking about end times literature, when we are talking about books that deal with these crises of not just confidence, but crises of all circumstance, crises of famine, of pestilence, of war, of natural disaster, etc., is that the prism through which we take in those kinds of messages really determines the effect that those messages will have on us, right? When C.S. Lewis wrote about witches and magic in his Chronicles of Narnia, his desire was not to elevate sorcery. His desire was to engage the imaginations of young people and old people, that he might elevate those imaginations to a different realm where more is possible than seems possible in the everyday. And so it is to C.S. Lewis that we again come for our close. One of his novels that is just fabulous and doesn't pertain directly to an end times focus, except that it's written from the perspective of a demon who is very invested in harvesting souls of the damned. And so you could say that it does have a bearing on end times. And of course, the book is the Screwtape Letters. But there is an addendum addendum to the Screwtape Letters called Screwtape Proposes a Toast, which speaks so directly to what we're talking about today, right? The conflict between good and evil, and the way in which that conflict has to be played out in the individual heart as well as in the vast civilization or society, right? So this is the demon Screwtape speaking to a gathering of fellow demons, higher and lower, and proposing a toast. And he is lamenting the fact that in modern times, really delicious, delectable sinners, great sinners, he calls them, have become fewer. So here we go. As the great sinners grow fewer, and the majority lose all individuality, the great sinners become far more effective agents for us. Every dictator, or even demagogue, almost every film star or crooner, can now draw tens of thousands of the human sheep with him. They give themselves, what there is of them, to him, and in him to us. There may come a time when we shall have no need to bother about individual temptation at all, except for the few. Catch the bellwether, and his whole flock comes after him. But I would not end on that note. I would not, hell forbid, encourage in your minds that delusion which you must carefully foster in the minds of your human victims. I mean the delusion that the fate of nations is in itself more important than that of individual souls. The overthrow of free peoples and the multiplication of slave states are for us a means, besides, of course, being fun, but the real end is the destruction of individuals. For only individuals can be saved or damned, can become sons of the enemy or food for us. The ultimate value for us of any revolution, war, or famine lies in the individual anguish, treachery, hatred, rage, and despair which it may produce. So there you have it. From the demon's perspective, all of the social upheaval in the world is valuable only to the extent that it can drive individuals away from God's saving grace. Food for thought for us, much less gruesome thought, food, than for the demon. Anyway, I hope that as you read, as you explore, as you enjoy even these great books about the end times, about dystopian societies, I hope that you will find in them inspiration and catalyst to savor the time that we have. Thank you.